Welcome to For the Record. I'm Naomi Coles. A mixed bag of results for both Republicans and Democrats in this week's Wisconsin midterms, in a year where historical headwinds normally wouldn't favor Democrats as the party in power. Governor Tony Evers pulled a 3-point victory margin over Republican Tim Michels. That's 3 times his win from 2018. But Democrat Mandela Barnes lost his bid by a point to incumbent Republican Senator Ron Johnson, now breaking down what went wrong and what went right. Democratic State Party Chair Ben Wikler. Ben, how are you?
I'm pretty good, Naomi. It's good to be with you today.
Absolutely. You know, one of my other guests on this show phrased this as a feeling of a weekend where Badgers win, Packers lose. Does that sound about right?
I think it's more like a come-from-behind victory and then losing by a hair's breadth against the last year's Super Bowl champions. This is a election that Democrats were supposed to lose across the board. National observers had written off our Senate race, and Mandela Barnes came within a point in the closest Senate race in the last century in the state of Wisconsin. The last time a Democratic governor won a race here in a year with a sitting Democratic president was 1962. And that year is by 1 point. This year is 3.5 points. So this was a wild overperformance relative to what anyone had a right to expect. And while I wish with everything I have that we could have closed that final point in the Senate race, Mandela Barnes ran a spectacular campaign, and Republicans didn't get the supermajorities they were shooting for in the state assembly. So Governor Evers' veto pen is intact.
So let's talk winning strategies. Ben, you've been the head of the state Democratic Party since just after Evers' election, if I recall correctly. You know, talk to me about what the strategies you put in place have worked this election, what you've been building over the last 4 years. What went right?
The core of our strategy is everything, everywhere, all the time. We've been running a year-round organizing program for the last 6 years in every corner of Wisconsin. For the first time, we ran a year-round voter protection operation, a year-round coalitions program working with Black, Latino, Hmong, LGBT, Native American Wisconsinites. We've been organizing digitally. We've been organizing virtually. We've been in communities, knocking on people's doors after the worst of the COVID pandemic receded. And that allowed us, from the numbers the Republican Party has put forth, allowed us to out-organize them by about 60%, a huge increase on the number of voter contacts that they were able to do. Meanwhile, we were able to work and plan over multiple years with Governor Evers' campaign, so they were able to communicate consistently on television, on rural radio, on every kind of screen that you can find about the governor's record, and then once we had Tim Michels, about his extremism. You can see in the Senate race the challenge on the other foot. Ron Johnson, after he announced in January, was continuously running millions of dollars in television ads and enjoyed a $27 million spending advantage by one estimate in the Senate race. And that netted him a 1 percentage point margin. Does not a lot, but when you're a candidate who comes out of a primary and then has to kind of recapitalize, and in federal races, the state party isn't allowed to play the same role in supporting the candidate, it meant that there was a critical period in September where Ron Johnson was hammering and pummeling, and it took Mandela's campaign, naturally, a little bit to be able to get the gigantic fundraising that they so succeeded in October.
So a little bit of that timing. I've heard a lot about that 2 weeks in September coming right out of the primary, where Mandela Barnes has just come out of a multi-way primary that, obviously a lot of people stepped out just as it was closing, but Ron Johnson just didn't have to deal with that in terms of beating out any opponents in the primary. So you think that kind of played that role?
That is. It's the challenge of a late primary. And frankly, Tim Michels wound up, in a way, having the same disadvantage, except that Tim Michels had a giant fortune and put $19 million of his own money into his race. So he can't really point to that in the same way. But it's clear that being the incumbent carries an advantage. If you say it was a 2-point advantage for Governor Evers, he still would have won re-election, amazingly. For Mandela Barnes, he would have beaten Ron Johnson if it wasn't for those 2 points as an incumbent. So I have my hats off to both of our top of the ticket candidates and to our Attorney General, Josh Call, who's just won re-election, and to the folks who were running down ballot. Republicans had such a clear shot at supermajorities in both legislative chambers. Jeff Smith won in western Wisconsin in the state Senate, but the GOP still has 22 out of the 33 seats now. In the state assembly, Republicans were within 2,499 votes of getting a supermajority in that chamber as well. And it was through the tireless efforts of candidates, of Democratic Assembly Leader Greta Neubauer, and so many others that we were able to stop Republicans from having the power to overturn the will of the people and override Governor Evers' veto.
Let me ask you this. Your role as party chair is partly to decide, what money goes where. So looking at the loss of the 3rd Congressional District in particular, especially as the balance of power is still hanging by a thread between each parties in the U.S. House, do you have regrets now, thinking back about how, money and resources was apportioned across Wisconsin?
So this is the difference between federal and state races. In state races, the state parties have enormous discretion to be able to provide support to candidates and campaigns, looking across geography and across different tactics. In federal races, the TV ad spending gap, it simply cannot be made up by state parties. The way federal law works is the state parties can't do that. It's the national party for federal races that has to make those decisions. And in the U.S. House, the National Democrats were fighting on so many fronts, they didn't bring the kind of funding into the 3rd Congressional District that the Republicans did. So there was a massive spending gap. I think I've seen 3-to-1 or 4-to-1. That's something I was sounding the klaxons and raising the alarm everywhere that I could. But for National Dems, they were on their heels in so many different places. If I could go back in time in both the Senate race and the House race and get more national investment in these races, I think it could have made a huge difference. And I hope that our friends across the country took notes on what just happened, because that race was within reach. And I think the Senate race was within reach as well. Now, on the Senate side, I know that the National Dems never let up in support. I just wish we could do more. And so that's, I think, the big lesson going forward. Never write off Wisconsin Democrats, even when the chips are down, because races here are so close and they're winnable.
So essentially, this is a national mistake.
I'm not in the driver's seat for the country, and I know that they had a huge kind of playing field where they had to make a ton of painful decisions.
There's many stories and lessons, obviously, to take away from what just happened in the midterms. What would be the final story that you would put out there that we haven't talked about yet?
The profound danger in this election was that if Republicans got a supermajority in the legislature or they won the governorship, they could change election laws so that, as Tim Michels put it, Republicans would never lose an election in Wisconsin again. It's a terrifying prospect, and it's profoundly un-American to think that one party would lock in control.
Ben, thank you as always for your time. I hope you get some sleep. I hope you get some rest. I know you're gearing up for the Supreme Court race next.
Thanks so much, Naomi.
Thanks. Up next, Republican analyst Joe Handrick on what went wrong on their side.